Okay, welcome back to those of you who may be viewing. We had a program with our guest that aired yesterday. That would have been the 5th of February, this being the 6th. We have another continuing conversation with a young man who I think is marked for importance in our society on a world scale, an intellectual scholar and a person who's very concerned with the human condition. That's Bakari A, and he's our guest. We closed out last week with a chart, the Buckminster Fuller, a person he admires, stating that we may have transcended material scarcity at this moment, this general moment in history, in terms of our capability technologically of providing life support with ecological concern, and whether or not that was something that appealed. We were talking to that, and I wonder, what do you think of that general proposition, if I may, as a question? And then also, I know you're very connected with the Zeitgeist Movement, great numbers of variegated thinking. In fact, it represents the world. There's a great deal of variegated thinking. Is it possible, particularly since you've written a book, or you're in the process of writing a book, enough for all, forever, seems to have redolent to the idea of possibly transcending material scarcity as a thing that could be developing in the time in which we talk now. And I wonder how those two things fit. Do you think we may be at a time of qualitative transformation, of transcending perhaps material scarcity as it affects human individuals and also institutional structures, and particularly the design of our economic, political, and social systems for an operating manual for spaceship Earth that may be relevant to what the future required, and the lack of that is being expressed in Occupy Wall Street and other items of discontent that are so manifest in the world. Do you think we're at a time of major qualitative transformation?
I think right now, we are dealing with a unique clash in terms of the financial system is bucking up against against its own limits, and then on top of it, we're also dealing with a resource reality, which is that we're now at this place where we have the ability to provide for enough for all forever on the entire physical planet. Now,
whereas we haven't had historically.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Okay.
One of the things that was important about that is that it's not something that we see. It's not something that we see in the world. It's just something that we sort of know in terms of the scientific reality of it, in terms of what other people who have looked at the resources have shown and said that, hey, this is something that exists, but we just haven't really manifested this in our behaviors and in the institutions that have been sprung up from that condition of scarcity that was
it may be a capability, but we have a lag by having reified outdated institutions that become outdated relative to the future, because we have our identities wrapped up in institutions that were in one condition, and that condition at the level of capability is a borning. So it's latent. It's like latent heat. Now,
dealing with that, there's a policy distinction that needs to happen at that point. And then there's actually movement that has to happen within people. There's got to be a change in the way that people interact with this new reality. But also there needs to be an awareness of that reality. There's not an awareness of it, and except for in small and growing institutions. And one of the first institutions that discusses this on a truly global scale is the Zeitgeist Movement, an organization that I work for, and that's one of the things that makes it unique, is that we're recognizing that scarcity as a reality is not necessarily the viable, or it's not really applicable to the current reality.
It's not, and particularly to the future.
Yeah, of course, and into the future. In fact, the very field of futurism has been talking about this post-industrial trend that's been happening in the developed countries.
That's right,
and that's what in the developed countries, in the major and industrial countries. But this is something that also the developing countries, the third world countries, are going to be going through themselves. This post-industrial trend, this movement towards miniaturization of resources, the miniaturization of goods and services, and also what Buckminster Fuller would call the formalization of these goods and services, the ability to use a resource an expanded way, use a resource in the most use the most of that resource in the most effective way.
So ephemeralization is doing more with less.
Doing more with less.
And it's through good design. And the microchip is a great example of that, is it not? A room full of vacuum tubes, a factory, it comes down to a thing that's going to go through the bloodstream and be ever more effective. There's lots of examples of doing more with less through good design, and that applies to ecology and other issues that seem intractable.
And that's how this becomes a comprehensive view of the world. This is how this becomes a comprehensive systems view of the world. Is when you start to realize that you can do more with less. When you realize that, and you start to apply that to different principles, different design problems that you have inside of the world. This is something that Russell Ackoff talked about in terms of his distinction between systems thinking and analytical thinking. So systems thinking was the idea, systems thinking resulted in synthesis and design thinking. These were the ways in which Russell Ackoff defined it. And he said analyst was the way that we get to analyst brings us to synthetic thinking. Systems thinking brings us to design thinking. And how do we design a world that works, like Buckminster Fuller would say, design a world that works for 100% of humanity. And that comes from first that recognition of that we have a world that has transcended scarcity.
That's a huge consumption. That's a big difference between 200,000 years of essentially scarcity. Again, I mentioned, I think I did, economics is defined as the allocation of scarce resources. It's assumed, if you say to somebody now walking in the street that we've transcended scarcity, they would say that's ipso facto absurd. Of course we don't. Everybody's starving.
When you think about the history,
you know what I'm saying.
When you think about the history of economics itself, the economic history that we've absorbed in terms of the people who live in America, who have undergone. Because the truth is, we've seen other resource-based economies, other societies resource-based economies. That's something we want to get to. Societies that operated with this consideration of using their resources to the maximum ability by using the least amount of those things. This is something that many agrarian wage societies operated under. These were the South American societies. These are the early African societies. A lot of these societies that had a resource plenty in their times, in their little regions, so they were able to deal with their societies in a much different way.
Plenty in terms of a particular aspect of an overall.
No, from an overall perspective, these societies, they were not warring societies. Because they had a resource. They had a resource abundance.
Like one of the main things you need is food, don't you?
And they had access to have
air. You have to have.
And it was also an underlying value trend that worked that accompanied their understandings about resources. There's some African tribes that talk about some African proverbs that say, "I get full when you eat." Right. So that's a circle of care. You broaden that circle of care. It's no longer just one individual concerned with his own self.
You're talking about Paleolithic time? Hunting and gathering?
Marshall Sahlins would call it Stone Age economics.
Stone Age.
But that distinction is not necessarily accurate.
It's also hard to know for sure what it was. Ashley Montague writes on that. They think that there was a great deal of cooperation inherited by man-woman pair bonding in order to survive the species. But
when you look into the histories of these early societies, because that's one of the things I was talking about in earlier broadcasts, is that when we think about history, we're not really looking at a great deal of it. We're only looking at a very small bit of history when we're talking about how it's not merely just the history of the world itself, but also the history of the human species. The human species has been here for 200,000 years. We didn't really start recording history to very recently, and we didn't have the modern economic systems that we have, including Adam Smith, until very, very recently, and something like 300 years ago. When Adam Smith, when he codified his concepts about the way the economic system would work, which was reinforced by Thomas Malthus and reinforced by David Ricardo and then reinforced by other thinkers along that lines, which includes F.A. Hayek and all of these other economists. They're all their roots intellectually come from this place of extreme scarcity. Not like certain things were, but extreme scarcity, where
You're talking 18th, 19th century
yeah, we're talking
Europe.
And this is when the economic systems, the economic systems that we live under were constructed.
Yeah, that's right.
So despite the fact that resources now have become to a place where there is enough, and as I explain in my book, enough for all forever,
that's a huge...
The economic history that we're living under, the structures that were built under this economic history, have all assumed that scarcity will be an ever-existing reality.
It's still assumed.
So if it's still there, then when you talk to somebody and say, hey, we don't live in a reality of scarcity in which I have to relate to you. This is in fact a false reality, a matrix, if you want to, and use the
that's which we've inherited.
And because we've inherited, it takes this awareness thing. It takes this into an awareness action, which the Zeitgeist Movement is taking, to tell people, hey, we don't live in this. We don't live in this reality of scarcity. We actually live in a reality in terms of our capabilities. You would say our capabilities allow us to interact with an abundant world.
In economics, if you make economics is a thing where, like, say, if you have a capability, you're going to make let's say you're going to make an investment. You're going to make an investment that's going to pay for itself out of its future earnings. That's the logic of, let's just say, generally business finance. You're going to make an investment. It will pay for itself out of its future earnings. So you're tapped into the future in a sense. That's different than when the capital accumulation that makes the investment possible is from past savings only. So that's they've been able to build that way, and that's the way the investment is done. There's no way in which you can tap into the future earnings in a sociological way where everybody can tap into the logic of we're coming into a future that has got great promise relative to the past. We have no way of having that redound to the interests of the mass of the population. Do you understand what I mean at a business level? So the way in which we form capital or invest in the future technology is one that leaves out of the equation the people to have the ability to be part of that investment procedure. Nobody would be able to grant them credit because they have no past savings to put up as collateral. So we need a way in which a population at large can be brought into the future earnings. It'll pay for itself in 5 or 6 years normally over the business cycle in a long time, but we don't have any way. That's one major problem about how we're going to form capital in a way and also distribute demand or buying power to the population in order to clear the market. Can any of that make sense to you? Or is it relevant in terms of making that bridge between the past institutional structure that is being transcended or subsumed some way, because that's most of your political and economic leadership, and it's going to be subsumed some way with the benefit of the general population and the ecology and the cooperation of all that Buckminster Fuller and other systems thinkers can see. That's a major question, how we're going to do that, is it not? Tap into the future, which is more promising than what has been assumed to be out of history. What do you think?
Sounds good.
No, I mean, does that make sense to you in terms of what you're thinking? Because enough for all forever is saying, in a certain sense, the title of your book that you and your colleagues are writing is positing a different world than that which we've inherited. In a qualitatively different way. No? So, and so that's what I'm thinking. And is that, why did you give the title of the book, Enough for All Forever? Did you come up with that at once? And what does it connote? And what's it trying to connote? Maybe you could talk about the book a little bit. Yeah.
Originally, my concept for the book was to take this film, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, which is a film that's got about 20 million views, 22 million views on YouTube.
That's a lot.
Yeah. A lot of people have watched it. It's about It's about 3 hours long. So 3 hours long for 22 million people to watch a movie is phenomenal. Basically.
Do they watch it all the way through?
Oh, of course. That's it's an
it's
incredible
grabber,
film.
Yeah. It's a grabber. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And one original idea that I was going to take was because I was really concerned with people asking me many questions about this, and me not being able to talk about this, talk about the idea of removal of scarcity and what it means to take a systems approach to the way that the world works.
It's huge, a huge issue.
It's because it's such a comprehensive view. I wanted to be able to understand it. So originally, when my idea was, I was going to take the film and I was going to source it in terms of all of the research that went into it, all of that. I was going to work with the director and all that. And when I spoke with the director, we decided that wasn't probably the best route for going with that. So I still was sitting on this huge pool of research that I had done, along with different people who I had been associated with, people at the University of Toronto, PhD students at the University of Toronto, University of Calgary, University. It's a whole bunch of different universities across.
Are these all part of the Zeitgeist family?
All of these, all of these, all of my researchers,
a growing family. It's
all of the researchers who are involved in my project are all members of the Zeitgeist movement. We all recognize and accept this reality.
No way to get a general.
George Washington University as well. These are strong students. These are people who have taken the opportunity to really look into this. University of Alberta,
a quantitative number, how many there are? Or
in terms of the members?
Yeah, just in general.
So in 2009, the Zeitgeist Movement membership was something about about 500,000 people.
500,000?
That was 500,000 people across the world. Now,
and these are all systems thinkers, serious scholars.
Yeah. So this was
2000. Yeah.
This was 2009.
Yeah.
The Zeitgeist Movement was founded in 2008.
Yeah.
Now, if in 2011 is when the movie Zeitgeist Moving Forward comes out, which gets 22 million views. And now today, all of the films, Zeitgeist, Zeitgeist Addendum, Zeitgeist Moving Forward, which are general expressions of Peter Joseph, which are not necessarily directly connected to the Zeitgeist Movement, but are still literature that people look to understand what the condition of scarcity that they no longer live in is.
You want to make a distinction. We live in it in a degree because a lot of our political decisions are made along those lines. But we are trying to get to live in something new or borning. So we don't live in it. It's that question of the transformation from one condition to another, and particularly when that's to include everybody. So you have to include and subsume some of the outdated institutions in a new pattern. That's systems thinking, and that's what's called for.
So the Zeitgeist Movement at that point had about 500,000. That was 2009. Then in 2011, the film comes out, which increases the membership. So again, we still haven't counted the membership since 2009. And then in 2012, all of the films are accessible on the popular media films, accessible places like Netflix, for instance. So all of these things are membership builder projects that we've done, including Zeitgeist Days and Zeitgeist Media Festivals, all of these different things that we've done as an entire movement. And these are all global reactions. So when we do things like Zeitgeist Day, which is a worldwide participation thing, where it's an educational platform, it's something that's going to actually happen in March. Our big, our major event is in Los Angeles this year. But when we do these things, in March.
Do you have a definite date?
I believe it's March 15th. I could be wrong.
March
you can find
15th.
anybody.
Don't make it the 17th.
Anybody can find out the information on regarding the Zeitgeist Movement on www.thezeitgeistmovement.com.
Spell it.
www.zeitgeist movement.com.
Okay.
So anybody can find the information there.
With the
and you can find information about the Zeitgeist Movement there. Now there's still that ticker that says how many movement, but that was an outdated ticker. So
it's growing.
It's constantly growing.
Yeah, good.
And constantly and that's the real important concept here. Is that information, because it serially develops, because people need to be able to tap into that group mind, the more people become aware of this reality. I believe there's a distinction where once an idea gets past 10% of the population, once 10% of any population understands or accepts the truth of an idea, then it expands to the entire population. And whether it disseminates or gets filtered out or whatever, but that's the idea, is that we can get the concentration of this information, which is very simple. How do we use the scientific method for the social concern? And also, can people recognize this reality of the transcendence of scarcity? And that's where the sort of theory.
Would you say that's a foundational principle, the transcending of scarcity among the Zeitgeist people, as a
I'm not sure
mission statement? No. the transcending of scarcity in a realistic level, whether it's ontologic or intellectual or real, is a major premise of the Zeitgeist movement.
I would say that we realize that if resources are used in an efficient way, if we apply the methods of science to the way in which we deal with production, the way that we deal with distribution of goods and services, if we figure out how to associate our values to and relate those to what nature tells us about our world.
Nature. Yeah.
If we associate these things, then we can achieve a type of abundance, a true global abundance for the entire human population, which is something that's never been before
including
seen.
Ecology.
Yeah,
including the ecology.
Of course.
And
the idea is
not at the disadvantage of anyone. So that means they're all inclusive of the human society as well, including the people who have a great vested interest in the outdated institutions to be subsumed, which would be a lot of your political and economic leadership.
The most important part of that phrase to me, though, is through spontaneous cooperation. There's nothing more important than that. There's no dictatorial. The philosopher Isaac talks about this. He says all of the 20th century alternatives to capitalism, every one of them, failed miserably. Fascism, Nazism, and socialism, whatever ways it was distinguished, whether it was Stalinism or whatever, all of those ended up failing miserably. So the question is, can we move past? Is there a way for us to move past using the market as a means for us to access goods and services from the planet? Can we access those things without turning back into totalitarian places where it's servant dominated? Servant and master domination kind of thing. Can we move past that? And can we be at a global circle of care where everyone's concerned? And so that's why I say spontaneous cooperation is most important. No one needs to be told or forced into whatever position. But if people come to this knowledge and through their own education, investigation, exactly. If they come to that knowledge and say, all right, I agree with this, and I've done the investigations necessary to support this, then they join the Zeitgeist movement, and we move forward, and we grow this growing awareness, and more people understanding and accepting this reality. And moving that forward.
And they could be inventing or having institutional structures into which they could fit and have it grow one for the other. Do you have a term? What is it called? A resource-based economy. And that's something that seems to be intrinsic to the Zeitgeist thing. What is meant by that in terms, does it tie into Henry George at all, or any of the thinking as to how we're going to form capital or the, tax structure or something? Resource-based economy. What is meant by that?
Well, there is a bibliography for a resource-based economy, and it's not very much talked about, and that's what the purpose of my book is. So anybody out there who's really concerned about this concept of what a resource-based economy is, once the book comes out, it should be completed by the end of this year.
By the end of the year.
By the end of the year, by the end of 2013, people should be able to have this bibliography that I think really informs the way Jacques Fresco and how others who talked about a resource-based economy came about understanding. So I think there is a measure of Georgianism that was involved. I haven't done enough research into Henry George. I have his book Progress and Poverty, but I'm starting to get a little bit more deeper into that.
You're aware in a little bit of Kelso?
Yeah, I know about Louis Kelso, the Capitalist Manifesto. The train of thought really begins with Frederick Soddy. It actually goes a little bit before Frederick Soddy with people like the physiocrats, a lot of these biophysical economists, a lot of early people who said that we need to figure out a way to tie our economic process into understandings about the sustainable, into understandings about what sustainability is. So that means tying our economic process to ecological principles and into thermodynamic principles. How do we understand the economy through the way that the world actually operates, as opposed to abstractions through financial capital, whatever, XYZs. So Frederick Soddy, in his book called Wealth, Virtual Wealth and Debt.
I'm not familiar when.
This was the early 19th century. This is very early.
England?
No, this is America. This is
American.
America.
Okay.
So Frederick Soddy, he writes his book, and he points out that wealth itself is not something that comes from money. Wealth is actually the capital that the earth actually has, the natural capital.
Well,
and that's what wealth is.
Yeah.
And
that was Henry George also. He said the resource should be owned by everybody.
Yeah. So that's what so that's why I said I have not done enough research into Henry George. This is a part of the process of writing a book.
Okay, good.
So Frederick Soddy took that and ran. And when you look into different interviews by Howard Scott was the founder of the Technocracy, Technocracy Inc.
Right.
And which was early founded, which was before it was called Technocracy, which was in 1933. Determination of the word, or not founding. What's the word for it? Incorporation of the word. They were called the Technical Alliance. And the Technical Alliance was an operation that was really a lot of these different Columbia University professors, a lot of people, friends of Albert Einstein, a lot of different well-funded and very well-versed scientific thinkers of that time. That's why it's the 1920s. A lot of these people, and they came to this distinction after doing tons of research, tons of surveys, tons of literature about the way that the North American continent worked, and not just the North American continent, but really going all the way up to Greenland and all this area. They decided that in this particular part of the world, that there was more than enough resources. So many resources are available that it made no sense for a price system where people have to access the market to get capital. They said that there was no reason for that to happen. What they felt that there needed to be energy credits, and energy credits, and that because the currency of the world really is in energy. The only true currency that exists in the world is energy. If you understand that, or if you accept that premise, then you build your economic system based on that. And then in 1933, they were discredited by a lot of different mechanisms. They were very popular in the beginning of the year, and they lost it out lost a lot of their membership by the end of the year.
By the end of the year?
By the end of that 1933 year.
1933.
Yeah.
But a lot of the Depression.
In the middle of the Depression. A little kid, something like 20 years old about this time, he's living in Brooklyn, and he hears about this. He hears about the technocrats. He sees the newspaper articles, Us and the Third, and he joins up, and he's the person who ends up 97 today. His name is Jacques Fresco. And Jacques Fresco took on the ideas of technocracy, but he also incorporated other ideas. He incorporated ideas of systems thinking, which was just slowly becoming much more profound.
Again, that Polish fellow.
And Alfred Korzybski, yes, absolutely.
Yeah, a good guy.
General semantics, and these are things that Jacques Fresco studied while he was trying to understand how do we make the world work for 100% of humanity. So you had other people. Use that language? I'm not sure if he used that particular language.
That's good to combine
but those are but these are other people who were thinking like this. So you had Jacques Fresco, who was thinking about how do we take care of the entire planet, and then can we take care of the entire planet? Buckminster Fuller doing the same thing, and other people who were associated with the technocrats, and other people who were associated with general semantics. But also you had people who were developing other forms of science, which was the cybernetics people, like Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener in 1948, he releases his book Introduction to Cybernetics, which ends up developing into the field of.
I had a friend, Mark Stallman. I don't even know him. He was he took AOL public when they went public. He coined the term Cyber Alley, for here rather than Cyber Valley, and his dad was in the room with Norbert Wiener in 1948 when they coined the term cyber.
Wow.
He was in the room, about 10 guys. They came up with, it means steersman, right, in Greek. But one of the things Norbert Wiener came up with was that information overload, which is a term you hear a lot, because we're being inundated with information, particularly multimedia information overload permits pattern recognition. So you can see patterns between systems, and that's the basis of thinking about the viability of systems thinking itself, because you can see patterns between all these different disciplines and so forth, and that's what's being encouraged in terms of systems thinking. But he was very much that way, and it's coming along practically like a snail's pace, and then it goes hyperbolic, and then it goes exponential, and it's going exponential now. The cyber stuff, and that's a model for the world that has to be taken into account in terms of communication, certainly. And for the growth of a systems way of approach, yeah.
So 1948, like you
talked 48
about,
it was,
Cybernetics is coined, the book is released, and then this is how the birthing of informatics and systems thinking and systems theory comes about. And then you have, and all of these people are building, trying to, and connecting, and not all of them, but most of them who are involved with the systems perspective are also incorporating its ecological principles and involved in it. So you have people like Donella.
Natural tie-in there, you think? Natural tie-in with the cybernetics and ecological thinking?
I think that there is a synergy between those two. So so you have people like Donella Meadows, who came out with the Thinking in Systems, but also came out with the book Limits of Growth. And you have the modern environmental movement building upon and using some of these principles of cybernetics and systems thinking.
Wasn't that Sam? No. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So Donella Meadows, the systems thinkers, all of these people are involved with this process of understanding systems thinking. And then in 1970, Jacques Fresco comes out with his organization, which is his original organization.
What year?
Called. This is 1970.
Okay. In my calculus, 1970 is likely to be seen in the history of time into this ever world where there's going to be enough for all forever like that. I think it's going to be seen as 1970 is going to be seen for reasons I could go into it, but won't, is the year one. There was a qualitative transformation occurring then. So it's interesting that book came out. A lot of other things happened in 1970.
So at that point, Jacques Fresco comes out with his organization. It's called socio-cyberneering, and trying to understand and applying social cybernetic principles to the economic process. And then he starts doing his city designs and XYZs. And later on, he develops the concept of a resource-based economy, which is the removal, which is really a global commons, a place where people can access goods and resources. A good way for people to understand this. This process of a global commons with people being able to access goods and resources without interacting with the market. It's a great example I like to give, which is 3D printing. So 3D printing is the process in which we create products we actually create products without having to interact with the market. How do you do that? So a printer.
Okay, go ahead.
A printer comes out. A regular printer.
Like a regular computer printer.
Regular printer prints out a two-dimensional piece of paper. And people are able to access that. But certain printers have the ability to actually print out entire physical models of things and build the actual thing, as opposed to you having to go out and get that. So imagine having that structure inside of your home, something that can print out physical objects.
Well, I'm trying to imagine. It's a little hard because it's a little far out. It's going to, let's say, a clock. A clock is a complex thing. The printer is going to create a clock or a design or something that could be used to make a clock, but not make the clock itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
How could they? They'd have to have the plastic and the phosphorus and everything built into the machine.
The printer prints out full working models of these objects.
A model I can see.
And because of the accelerating tradition of technology, is that the 3D printer is only going to advance itself. It's only going to advance itself. And the more and more these things become more, more they become more populous throughout the environment, where more people are having access to these things, the less people are interacting with the market. The more people are interacting with their own printers in their home and creating objects that they need.
But I can't. Wait a minute. Are you going to print a Ferrari? I mean, how far can you go? Are you going to print a Learjet? I mean, what? I don't quite understand.
That's the fascinating.
I can't understand.
That's the fascinating thing about 3D printing, is that it's gotten to that point. There are 3D printers that print homes, that print cars, all the way the full working model. And that's
super automation.
Super automation.
But how can that be? I mean,
so if we
be a little bit more practical. How can you how can you have a printer like the thing where we have a printer turn out a car? I mean, you'd have to.
Well, it's not. Of course, it's not going to be. Of course, it's not going to be like the little printer that you have inside of your home. What I'm saying is, if we are building technologies that are removing people from the workplace,
that's very important.
We're removing people from the workplace, so we no longer have people working on cars. We have people printing out their cars.
So that printer will be connected to a factory that makes a car. And the design can be sent over the printer, and it can be kicked into rear, and it can be robotized, and you don't have to have people to make the car.
So people don't need to be involved with the production process of creating a car. People don't have to be involved with anything more than the actual usage of the material.
Why the 3D printer that you use as a model? Why the printer? Why not just say it's super cybernation where you can have robotics create cars?
The 3D printer.
Why is the printer? You have to send it from here to there.
The 3D printer is just an example of how this becomes something that's accessible for you in your own home. That's just an example.
Accessible in your own home.
That's just an example of how automation technologies are slowly removing people from their own jobs and also removing people from having to access the market. So if people don't have the money to access jobs, I mean, if people don't have that money to access the market, but they're also losing their jobs. Well, we're having a fundamental clash here. We're having a clash. Well,
that's another thing.
We're dealing with the clash of how resource abundance is harming the marketplace.
Resource abundance. When you talk about resource, okay, I know. John Maynard Keynes set up most of what is called the modern economy. You know, in the 30s, out of the Depression, International Monetary Fund, the Bretton Woods, and that. And John Maynard Keynes set that up. And in 1930, he wrote a letter to his grandchildren, and he warned of something that was very hard for people to understand, because we had in the United States, we had a growth period coming up out of the Second World War that was phenomenal, middle class and all that. And he said, you're going to be confronted with something in their maturity, the generation, which would be about now, massive technologically induced unemployment. Okay, now he's the demand side person who would get some demand, and so forth, in competition with, you know, the supply siders and everything. And if you have massive unemployment, it's a very real problem in a practical sense, because the vast majority of the capital formation is done by the people who have the past savings. It gets more concentrated. Again, back to that business model, they make an investment in the future that's going to pay for itself out of its future earnings. So they're tacked into the future. That's the thing. But that ability to have that is limited to a small, tiny 1% of the population is getting overwhelmingly wealthy because the technology is what's creating the wealth. That's robotics and so forth. And so the people are going to be displaced, and they're not going to be able to have the money to clear the market. So that demand question is not there. So you have to have an alternate way to get demand in buying power, money into the hands of the people, if they're not going to be needed as wage earners, or even you could use their loaded term, wage slaves. That's a larger issue brought up. And that's a large issue that's confronting us all. How are we going to get money into the hands? We got a present problem with the, you know, the debt ceiling and all that kind of stuff, because we don't have a system that can get demand into the hands of the people other than a wage earner who gets paid for their labor and celebrates the labor input to production, which is being displaced by our technological advancement into this world of surfeit for everybody. That's a kind of that's a big policy issue confronting the world leadership. And that distinction, that exact distinction, is also coupled with an ecological crisis. Absolutely.
These things are so it's simultaneous crises that are happening all across. And then there's also the one that most least talked about, but probably the most important one, which is the value crisis that we're dealing with. We're dealing with human values that are accelerating the consumption. We find a sense of ourself in the consumption that we do. We find other people thriving to get to that level of consumption, which accelerates the crises in the ecological environments, which accelerates the crises in the financial environments.
Is that part of a greed on the part, or part of status seeking? Or?
There's levels of causality that involves, but I think that it really comes down to this awareness problem. If people become aware of the crises, most people don't even know aware of these things. They're not in their everyday environments. We're not seeing, they're not interacting with these things. Their television shows, they don't talk about these things. Their policy leaders, they don't bring these things up. They mostly encourage people to behave in their day-to-day environment.
People are accustomed to things, and they, you know, habits get formed and everything.
So that's what was so phenomenal about this film, Zeitgeist Addendum. But as being a frame shaker, it changed, my way of of looking at the way that I behave inside the world, and looking at the way that other people behave, looking at the group behaviors of people, and get away from this thing where I blame a politician for not, but start to realize that there is a underlying value problem. One of the two major value problems that are described in the film, it's this problem of not recognizing the symbiosis that we have in our within ourselves and with the environment and with each other. Right? If you don't understand that your integrity is really only as important, is really only as secure as the integrity as every other person on the planet, and only as secure as every other thing on the planet. The actual planet itself ensures your integrity. If you don't recognize that, then you're gonna have big problems. If and not just you, it's not if you don't recognize that, but if your environment doesn't recognize that, and if the behaviors you do, they don't if the behaviors you do are reinforcing that you don't have to concern yourself with that
right, as it would come out of history.
Exactly. So all of these economic structures reinforce scarcity. So people behave as if they live in a scarce world because everything around them informs their belief in
Well, all right, but and also all of human history does that, because really, in a very real sense, particularly if you're talking about how do you define, like we said before, how do you define haveness and that kind of stuff, and you're coming into a kind of situation, because throughout all of history, there's never been enough. It's always been a matter of, I win, you have to lose. I can conquer you, and then I can win, and you lose, and you know, and it's the basis of politics, which is whoever's got the power, or the gun, or the machine gun, or the Gatling gun, or the cannon, or the tank, or the atomic bomb can rule over the other. Realpolitik holds in terms of the politics, because there's not nearly enough. There be enough is the most qualitative transformation possible to imagine in terms of the emerging situation. Are the people in the zeitgeist very wrapped up with the idea of Gaia, James Lovelock, that sees the human, the whole of evolutionary process sort of as an organism?
So
like,
I think,
if I may, one thing,
in
a human organism, on the average, is about 100 trillion cells. Most of them are in the gut. And so with bacteria, we all walk in a sea of bacteria, but in the human organism, about 100 trillion cells. Each cell matters, and each cell is in communication with all the others as a system, part of systems training. So Gaia is, if you take the whole, or some of Rupert Sheldrake, and then you take the whole and see the whole as like you draw off and you see it like as an organism, you know? Like you see a human being, 100, you don't see 100 individual cells. They all do you understand what I'm saying? So that there's a symbiosis between all of the cells that makes up a system. So I don't know, you know, James Lovelock in England, and that, does that come into some of the reading or the literature that's involved with the people in the zeitgeist or not? Or would it?
Nothing.
That's also like synergy in a sense that Fuller brought famously to the fore.
So there's nothing directly in our literature that talks about Gaia, but I think that there are parallels, and I think that, and a big degree is this, that there's nothing in Dr. King's literature, for instance, that references the Zeitgeist Movement. There's nothing in Gandhi's literature that references the Zeitgeist Movement. But you can see the parallels between what they were talking about. There is a civil rights imperative for understanding the ecology. These are the things that and supporting the ecology. To understand, there's a civil rights perspective and understanding what it means to spontaneously allow people to spontaneously cooperate and find ways that allow people to spontaneously cooperate. There is a civil rights imperative and understanding that 100% of humanity needs to be taken care of, and that if just one person is not being taken care of, that's too much. That's where Dr. King says, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. There's an imperative to understand that there should not be any disadvantage of anyone. No one should be disadvantaged.
Particularly since we have an unusually huge, unique capability. The ontology or the reality was scarce. I mean, when we came out of the cave, all the oil was here, everything was here, but we had a technological liaison of being able to use the resources, some, you know, ecological and evolutionary advantage. The 200,000 years it took us to do it, you know, but all the resources were here. And so that there's something new that's culminating in like a, in evolution, you have a system steady state, and then there comes a punctuated equilibrium. It's like a a quickening in a pregnancy, and then the new appears. And we got all the variety of species and so forth. And I can't help thinking there's a movement coming. I don't know if you heard or got in touch. Transhumanism. People are beginning to think in terms of trans Homo sapien. Relationships in universe that might be the result of some liberated order of a maximally engaged humanity that would result in some synergistic resonance in universe that would be transcendent to what we've been throughout 200,000 years of our sojourn on Earth. Anyway, I'm off on a track that maybe I shouldn't be. But I think we're at a time of qualitative transformation, yeah. So spell out some more. So the Gaia is not directly involved. Resource-based economy, that's important to both the Zeitgeist and so
the
forth.
Venus Project, yeah.
Yeah, and the Venus Project, yeah. So you're writing the book. You think you might have it done by the end of the year, and also you think that this movement is growing, and it links up with Buckminster Fuller Institute carrying on his. What other people from history or systems thinker, comprehensive thinkers, particularly say in economics, is there found within the Zeitgeist camaraderie of the people that make it up? Who do they like? Do they like Keynes? Do they like any of the economists that we talked to?
Well, there's a huge distinction that the Zeitgeist Movement makes when we talk about resource-based economy. Resource-based economy is a non-monetary economy. It's a futuristic perspective to some degree, but it's a system that does not operate with money at all.
Okay.
Now,
well, that's pretty odd. Yeah.
Yeah. So as a result of that, it puts a distinction between all monetary economies.
Yeah.
So that puts a distinct. So the perspective that Henry George had, Thorstein Veblen had, Hefe Hayek, all of them, and then we have this other school of thought of how do you operate an economy without money, and that's a much
that's a whole different thing. How are you going to do an economy without money, particularly in the transition phase? It seems to me if there's any one thing, if you're just thinking in general terms about the world, society and everything, what is it that holds society together now, institutionally and so forth, in terms of society, I guess around the world and everything? Seems to me the most important thing in most forced or otherwise, or by choice, the most important thing, the most important value that has meaning in terms of holding society together now is money. Everything is based on money. Everybody has to get their job. Everybody has to get a job in order to get food. And that either because you can't get it, you don't have means of buying the needs you have, but money is the most important thing in the consciousness of most people now. And now you're saying you're going to have an economy where you don't have to have any concern with money. That's a big jump, is it not?
It's a huge jump.
How?
And
how do they deal with the like Mr. Obama is going to come now? They're going to debt ceiling thing. All these issues that are so at the center of the news and the center of the political and economic establishment that runs the world by and large, the Congress and everything. How are you going to deal with the questions that are of concern to them, which has to get into economic theory? Keynes, Schumpeter, and the whole business, and you got all the things coming from the Republicans and so forth, having different issues. It's all revolving around ultimately money. And credit and the way the system's going to be structured. So, so how do they deal with the established order?
So there's a couple things that are important to talk about when we're talking about how to at least think about a resource-based economy. First thing is you can't think about a resource-based economy in terms of tomorrow. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to be
long-term.
So that's one of the major problems when we're dealing with investment class thinking, or when we're dealing with
investment class thinking.
Is that when we deal with investment class thinking, we're only talking about what is the next cycle. So either whether we're talking about the next election cycle or we're talking about the next quarterly earning cycle, that's not long-term thinking. That's not systems thinking at all. But when we're talking about resource-based economy, we have to project that forward. We have to recognize that there are institutions that are barriers to that type of learning, that type of perspective. But one of the fundamental perspectives on this, the first thing that you have to understand is first this distinction about scarcity. This thing that we've been discussing for the last hour or so, not hour or so,
it's a huge issue.
If people first come to that recognition, which is what all economic systems have been built up. All economic systems.
It's a foundational principle.
All Marx, Thorstein, every person, every economic thinker has been dealing with the intellectual genealogy that goes back to Adam Smith and the early economic thinkers, that go back to John Locke even.
Yeah. Natural law.
Yeah. All of these things coming out of that, all of these scarce time periods, right? But but that's just a certain part of human history. That's not all of human history when we're talking about where economic thinking comes from. So there are other people who have thought about how do we deal with resources in a way that doesn't operate with money. There's South-Pacific societies that didn't deal with money. And that's what I talked about earlier, agrarian wave societies that were resource-based economies where people contributed to a global commons.
I guess there were places that didn't have money. They had ways of exchange, or they could trade. So.
Now some of these things were still dealing in the problem of scarcity. So instead of dealing with money, they were trading in individual resources. But there were also common areas where people were able to access goods.
Before the enclosure movement in England, that was horrible.
So then you have people like Charles Eisenstein right now who are talking about gift economies. How do we move the capitalist structure into a gift economic structure, which is a sort of a transitional phase till we get into this point of non-money. Now, again, you cannot think about this thing in terms of tomorrow. When you think about it in terms of tomorrow, of course the ramifications happen. But
because we have to lay us on, but we do have to lay us on with the historically inherited institutions and the people who represent them, and have them subsumed within this new way.
And that's why
you need something that includes everyone without a disadvantage anyone.
And that's where the policy work comes in.
That's the ultimate
and that's
challenge.
where I hope to see members of the Zeitgeist Movement really stepping into roles where now that you have the awareness, now that you understand what the reality of the world is, what the capabilities that the world have, then we start to interact with decision makers and push them forward to start thinking about different ways of interacting with the policy, interacting with the reality of the reality of the environment. So not removing yourself from the political structures of the world, not removing yourself from the economic structures of the world, but finding opportunities, which is what Buckminster Fuller said, being a trim tab. How do you stick yourself? How do you stick yourself into a place where just by you being inside there, you can push the economic structure in such a way that your presence there, just your very presence there, creates change. And I think that's what people like Maurice Strong did, and what Grohan Brundtland did, and other people who are involved with the sustainable development movement. They put themselves into places where just their very presence there, they were able to forge common understandings and bridge build. That's what people like Martin Luther King did, where by being there, by being a symbol, being a person who questioned, who asked the strong questions to decision makers. That's why we remember him so much. He spoke to. We have plenty of pictures of him in the White House, hanging out with Lyndon Johnson, pushing him to make those strong understandings about the way that the world
operates. And there was a movement that was blowing in the wind that gave a lot of force to the sails that were pushing that forward. Everything like that. The trim tab is a very interesting idea because I'm not sure people know that. That was a term he said, I think on his tombstone, call me trim tab. I think it is. Trim tab is on a big ocean liner. When you're moving a big ocean liner, let's say the World Economy or something like that through the air, they has a big rudder at the back that is what turns the ship. But in order to get it started, that process, there's a little tiny rudder that's called trim tab on the ship that is turned in a certain way that begins the process of moving the big rudder. And so a trim tab would be like a futurist orientation or linking to that. And a future orientation is the lot. An investment banker has to have a future orientation if they're considering an investment. You want to invest in something that's going to pay. Logic of business finance, logic of ecological finance, logic of political finance is you want to have an investment that's going to pay for itself, benefit out of its future earnings. Okay, so that you can tap into the future earnings. You get that before? That's Kelso. And that's limited to so few because nobody has the collateral to put up. So, but you have to get that, you have to have a way of forming the capital that's going to make the technological thing possible. Henry Ford built River Rouge, and so you have to have investment, and you have to have that investment distributed out among the people in general to bring them in on the logic of investment philosophy. Is you're tapping into the future. That's what we need, because that's a bridge between the past and the future, and the zeitgeist and so forth. Not resource economy is a future thing that you have to have, and you have to have something that can involve everybody. So there has to be a way in which the population in general is going to be able to be having buying power in terms of the invest. So it's a real challenging time. When you say it's not tomorrow, does that mean it's not for another 1,000 years? Or when would it be? Are we dreaming about something that could be or can be, or is it going to be? The anchor of history is very, very heavy, and the inclination for people to associate with institutions in place and get their identities will be wrapped up in roles they have within a context that's being qualitatively changed in terms of a future emerging. Do you understand? All of that is part of the big challenge, is it not?
Yeah. I think that, and I'm not a prophet. I'm not here to say.
You're not a prophet.
I'm not here to say, you know, when or how or who or what's going to happen. But what I do honestly believe, I don't believe that change is going to happen amongst the decision makers at the top. I don't think it's going to happen amongst the power elite. I don't think that's where it's going to happen.
You don't think they have to be involved?
I think, of course, they have to be involved, but I don't think that's where change is going to happen.
It's going to come among. Is it a youth thing? Do you think the youth have an advantage? Go ahead. At this point. So I don't we have about 3 minutes left.
Okay. So I don't think change is going to happen with decision makers. And one of the major reasons why I don't think so is because their goals and ambitions are wrapped up into the structure that exists right now. So what they're trying to,
also going to have to be brought in at
absolutely.
Some point.
What I'm not discounting that. I'm not discounting their participation. What I'm saying is I don't think their goals and their ambitions are wrapped up in the existing structure. So right now, you know the term reifying? Absolutely.
Reestablishing outdated institutions of which the identities of most of the people are wrapped up. You understand? So it's identity that is also important.
So that's what I mean, is that these things are the institutions support their goals and ambitions. So they're trying. So that doesn't mean that they're negative people, that they're horrible people. It just means that what they're trying to accomplish is whether or not they're trying to accomplish these things in the global in their own environments, or whether or not they're trying to accomplish these things on a global scale.
And also be
they're
practical.
wrapped up there. Now, and I also don't think that change is necessarily going to come in the lower 2 billion people who are starving to death on this planet. I don't think that's going to happen there, because these people actually have to do on their day-to-day basis try to figure out ways to eat. I don't think that it's going to happen within the 200 million people who are rich and don't have to deal with the pressures of these things. I think it's going to come amongst this group of people who are having a growing awareness, who are becoming increasingly concerned about the environment, who are increasingly informed of the ecology, increasingly concerned about our economic systems, and are becoming aware, who have the awareness of this, but also they have the choice to decide whether or not they're going to go and decide to be a rich person, or if they're going to decide, and by rich person I mean just moderately rich. I mean somebody who's focused primarily on capital, or if people are going to decide to make the choice and to be an activist, or be an activist in whatever measure, whether you're going to be an activist in academia, whether you're going to be an activist out speaking, but to bring this information about what the reality of the world is, and hopefully be able to bring that change and then incorporate the decision makers, so that we can help the 2 billion people who are starving to death on this planet, and also be able to change the minds of the people who are so indoctrinated in their own ways that they don't really see the difference. Well,
it's a big challenge for it as well. It's educational, it's across the boards, it's political, and it's going to be carried by a whole lot of different kind of people. I would like to put in a little small punch for this thing, or a little plug for this thing called public access cable television, which has a unique financing capability to bring production capability to the masses of the people. We got 3,000 of them across the United States. We got Manhattan Neighborhood Network and all the good people that are here, and that's a place where a lot of the media could be developed. And then the media is part of an educational process that could be informing even the educational institutions themselves that I think are out of date, coming from that environment. So it calls for a lot of challenge, but in anything, one of the people who might be in the van of doing that would be a guy named Bakari Page, who has been our guest. Bakari, thanks a lot for coming in. All the best. I know you got a lot of things lined up where you're trying to do.
Thank you for championing this. So this is really I'm very happy that you continue championing a lot of the stuff that you've been doing.
Well, I'm trying to keep up with you guys.
I looked into a lot of your work over the past couple of years. Well, past decades actually.
Really about 45 years or so. Okay, your pleasure to have his perceptions. We invite you to tune in. Next time we'll be coming back again. But let's by all means stay in touch. We'll be in touch with one another. And thank you for viewing. We're coming back tomorrow. Thank you.